Hello and welcome back to this. Today's episode is just brought to you by the books I have on my shelf and lack of an idea of what to actually speak about this week. So I read a lot of Russian literature. I remember going into a shop a little while back and saying I want to move away from fantasy and I want to start reading some really gritty stuff. And I remember the woman handed me Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls, which is an amazing book, and I'll refer to that later on in the video. But I started reading that and getting really into Tolstoy, and I attempted to read War and Peace very early on, but didn't really work out. But either way, I have read a lot of Russian literature, and it's always, for some reason, been one of these things. It's like with philosophy and me. I don't aim to just read French philosophy. It's just whenever I find a philosophy that I agree with, it just so happens that the majority of it is French. Same with literature. A lot of classical literature, yes, I like Dickens, etc. But the majority of what I actually look at just happens to be Russian. A little while ago, I went into a charity shop, or a thrift shop, as you Americans call it, and just picked up some books, and then it wasn't until I got in the car that I realised, oh, they're Russian. And I want to state from this point that I am not a communist, I am not a socialist, I don't believe in any of that, and if you are one of those, you are one of the most uneducated and dangerous people on the planet if you believe in that stuff and think it's actually good. I only read about the Communist Manifesto for better understanding of what happened in that time period and what their beliefs were. A shame I even have to do that disclaimer. It is a real shame. But into the main essence of the video, I feel that Russian literature is an amazing form of literature that you cannot get anywhere else, especially with the postmodernists. But it was a very old place. It didn't like change. The Tsar was still in charge. Even in the 1880s, which is a lot of the classical Russian literature takes place in the 1880s, you still had serfdom. You had what were called the mushiks, who were basically slaves. They could be paid whatever the owner wanted. Yes, they were owned, they were property, and they could be paid whatever, if anything. There was no law. And then when they were dead, you had to pay tax on how many of these slaves you owned. I mean, this is in 1880, and they're property. People were property. Okay, you were paying tax on how many you had. And this brings me to the book Dead Souls, which is an amazing book about society, because at this point Russia was a very it was very much do what you want, because the government has no power. It's all the Tsar, and the Tsar is a very weird man. So you pay tax on dead people until the next census, and this isn't like the census we have in the Western world, where it's every 10 years. This census could happen whenever. It could happen in 30 years' time, it could happen the next day. It could happen every week. You never know. So you could be paying tax on these dead people for the next 20 years, or you could be paying it until, the next census. But enough of the history class on Russian literature. You see, the Russians were a very isolated, backwards type of people, which is exactly what I've just said they weren't, but I mean it in a different sense this time. They still had slavery up until 1880. It wasn't really until the early 1900s that they got rid of the Tsar and started, making socialism and then communism. And it's this that I feel is a living history. A lot of slaves in America couldn't read or write. They just couldn't. And so there isn't much literature about the life of a slave. There isn't much literature about what a slave did. And if a slave owner wrote something, they would write themselves as like the hero, and it's a very it's a very biased point of view for something to happen. But because I'm talking from the postmodernist perspective, so that's about 1900s to present day. World War II was a horrible time for the Russians because of Stalin and the late Lenin. They had institutionalized an amazing amount of slaves in Siberia. You stole a loaf of bread, 6 years, and that wasn't even definite. They could say, oh, actually, we need you for a bit longer. We're prolonging your sentence. And so you could be there for ages. But people were, of course, alive before Stalin was kind of there. So they were educated people. They were a very educated people in mathematics, literature, science. And so a lot of the people that were enslaved were actually very, very educated people. And I want to speak about a certain writer who, this is the person I went into the thrift shop and then found. His name is Solzhenitsyn, or Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, that's how I'm pronouncing it. I could be totally wrong, but read that there. My pronunciation is Solzhenitsyn. And he was amazing. I picked this up because it was more the sickle and hammer that caught my eye. I am sorry, there is a glare. And this bloke, I did not know how much of an impact he had on Russian culture, as he was awarded a Nobel Prize for this novel, and these are all about his time when he was enslaved and sent to Siberia. He was just told, go to Siberia, and then he was sent there, and then he got cancer, and it's this gritty, down-to-life, and I don't think any other writer could show the horrors of Stalinistic Russia than this bloke. And if you do want a good book to read by him as a start-off point, I recommend A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. This one, very, very short book, only about 140 pages long, but it is a day in the life of a Siberian worker. You are woken up, given crumbs of bread, and it talks about, like, how money worked there, how, like, the ranking system worked, how the guards had so complete power, and how cold, some people got frostbite and their fingers fell off, but they still made you work. And this, for being how short it is one of the best books about war I have ever read. Okay, I finished this in 2 days, purely because of how page-turner it was. So I'd recommend reading this. This one is, of course, a bit fatter, but it's amazing. And as I've said earlier, this is the reason why we need to start reading postmodern Russian literature. Classical Russian literature is amazing. And I'm going to make a defense here, because every literature is amazing. British, American, African, whatever. But Russian literature holds this ember which can be lit and resparked, and unfortunately Russia goes through a lot of changes. At the moment there's a conflict there, and that will have stories made. 100 years ago there was a conflict there, and stories rise from the ashes. About 50 years before that, the crumble of the Tsar happened. They burned the capital, and stories were written from that. In 1840 or 1850, I believe, there was, of course, the Noble 600, which is mainly told from a British perspective, thanks to Alfred Lord Tennyson, but the Russians also had a perspective on that, so stories were written. And it's this living history where a lot of people who were in slavery, and I'm talking about, like, black slavery right now in America, you they didn't know how to write. They didn't know how to read, they didn't know how to write. So once Abraham Lincoln said you're free, none of them could do anything except for tell their story. And then over the years, that's been changed and heard by people. And it's like Chinese whispers. We now have a completely different story than what was a couple hundred years ago. But this only happened about 100 years ago, when people can read and write, and it was known. This man left university with an amazing maths degree. And it's this pure, concrete evidence of what happened. And this is, and I ramble on there because I don't know how to describe. I'm a man of words. Words are my life. I make a living through words, but I don't have the words to state how important Russian literature is for the founding blocks of what needs to happen in a society, what needs to change in a society. Stalin was a horrible, horrible man, but we can take from that and learn from it. Say, don't be like this. And I'm lost here. I absolutely love this. It's a concept I love. Now, granted, yes, The Diary of Anne Frank is a beautiful insight into a girl's young mind. It's not even an insight, because to state that it's an insight is to state that it's fiction. It was something written to resemble a girl's mind in Auschwitz. No. This was a girl in Auschwitz. So, yes, there are things like The Diary of Anne Frank, as well as many other German pieces. There, of course, are going to be some slaves who could read and write, and so they have written stories. But the majority couldn't. This, Stalinistic Russia, was one of the first times when the mass in captivity could read and write. And Jordan Peterson has stated that if you can read and write, you are the most dangerous person on the planet. And these people are the only living testimony to what happened behind closed doors. And even this, he's not living anymore. So this right here that I hold is the only testimony to what actually happened behind the doors of the Siberian camps. None of it's fake, none of it's fiction. A dragon doesn't swoop out of the sky and knock out Stalin. No. It's concrete. It's truth. It's beauty. It's freedom. But it's not freedom. And these people are the martyrs who have changed the course of an entire movement. Okay? Because Stalin tried to make his ideal world. Propaganda everywhere. He spent years building up these blocks to make himself the most powerful. Anyone that went against him was wrong, and they would be enslaved and silenced and shunned away from the public, kind of cornered over, and he would focus his attention on the mindless people that would follow his every move, either through fear or just because they were that naive that they actually liked him. But then these people came along. Okay, Solzhenitsyn, as well. I'm sorry, I can't really name any other postmodernist writers in Russian literature, as I've not gone that far. I've read a lot of the classical pieces. I would say Solzhenitsyn, and that's about it. I do want to read more, so if you do have. But these people are the martyrs who then, when he died, they rose up and said, this is how it actually was. These 360 pages are the tale of an entire man's life, wrapped up. His skin and essence and blood and sweat and toil and years of slavery are wrapped up here. And all you have to do is open it. Learn from it. Take from this what you will. Now, granted, yeah, I've harped on, and you can probably see from me that I feel very strongly about this. I feel very strong about Russian literature because it is life. in action. Russia is one country that has such a hold. They are so large, mammothly, inconsequentially huge, but yet they hold an ever-changing society, from the Tsar to socialism to communism to now, and now to bordering on dictatorship. They are constantly changing, and let's call these series, every series, there is a different group of these martyrs who will rise up with their pens and paper and write the truth and show beauty from bloodshed. And that is something that I find amazing. A piece of pen and dead tree. But yet them can be spread to millions, and you can say words and write words that are that impactful, that for hundreds of years people will look at this and say, oh, that Stalin was a horrible man. And that's to sugarcoat who Stalin was. And yes, this is a very long video because I have a lot to say on this, and I will do a couple videos where I do talk about Russian literature in a bit more detail, about the classic and the postmodernist, but this is my overview on why I absolutely love it. I will leave in the description below a load of pieces that you can pick from, and they will be in order. So, like, I recommend you start with the top and end with the bottom. And yeah, and so that is it from me for today. I am sorry the lighting, because I've got a window there, the lighting's been a bit off. I do have a load of short stories, essays and journals, as well as the newsletter. So if you'd like to sign up for the monthly newsletter, all of that stuff, link in the description below. And until next time, see ya.